Good morning. I want to welcome everyone to the next in a series of Summer First Friday events that we're holding here at the Greater Pittsburgh Chamber of Commerce. I want to thank all of you for joining us. We're very excited about our guest today. As many of you know, we started this series back early in the pandemic. It is, is the Greater Pittsburgh Chamber of Commerce, an affiliate of the Allegheny Conference on Community Development. We are holding our response and recovery COVID-19 webinar series events, and the First Friday events that we typically hold in person have now been transitioned to become part of the response and recovery series. And we're very happy, as always, for the support of our sponsors, Peoples, Giant Eagle, Highmark Health, and UPMC Health Plan for helping us put on events like the one we're doing here today with new Pennsylvania House Majority Leader Kerry Benninghoff. We're very excited to have Representative Benninghoff with us here today. As many of you know, he's been a longtime friend of the Greater Pittsburgh Chamber of Commerce, and we're very excited to work with him as we have in the past, but now in his new role as Pennsylvania House Majority Leader. I also want to thank our list of sponsors that you can see on the screen right now. I won't run through them all, but as many of you know, we weren't able to hold our typical June Harrisburg reception that we co-host jointly with the Chamber of Commerce for Greater Philadelphia. And a lot of these folks and great sponsors were on board for that event, and we want to make sure that we recognize their consistent and steadfast support of our advocacy and political efforts here at the Greater Pittsburgh Chamber of Commerce. As I said, we're very happy to have new Pennsylvania House Majority Leader Kerry Benninghoff with us today. We're going to work through the process right now of pivoting over to Majority Leader Benninghoff. Jennifer Beer, our Vice President of Government Affairs, will handle the question and the answer. So after Representative Benninghoff speaks, we're going to open it up for you to submit your questions, and you could submit them via the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. But as I said, we're very happy to have Representative Benninghoff with us today. He's been a longtime friend of mine personally. I served with him in the Pennsylvania House from 2006 to 2010. Had the pleasure of serving on the House Finance Committee when Representative Benninghoff was the chair of that committee, and really has been a longtime advocate, not only for his district, which is the 171st district up and around Center County, but also the work that he's done on behalf of the Greater Pittsburgh region. And he's been a longtime advocate for this region as well. And we're very happy that he's in his new position, and we're very happy that he's able to join us here today for our Summer First Friday series. And so without further ado, I will throw it over to new Pennsylvania House Majority Leader Kerry Benninghoff.
Good morning, everybody. I think that was a test to see if I could mechanically, I just missed part. I think we're unmuted. Good morning, everyone. Thank you for having us here. As Matt said, I enjoyed serving with him, and he was a great member of our Finance Committee and a good member. You were fortunate to have him as your leader out there at the Chamber. I wanted to share a couple thoughts with you, but also remind members that are listening that we don't have to be geographically living in your region to care about your area. I believe that these urban areas are very, very important to our Commonwealth as a whole. And by disclaimer, actually, you have stolen two of my children who live out in the Carnegie area and Benicia down in Washington County. So we come out for pleasure reasons as well. Came out a couple weeks ago to celebrate my grandson's first birthday, and was out last week for 3 days visiting some of the different businesses in your area, prospective businesses. And I think as a leader of the House, it's important for us to do these types of visits to get a better comprehension of what is going on in other regions of the Commonwealth. I happen to live right in the very middle of the state, and so we're traveling the state pretty aggressively in the last couple of weeks, and we'll continue to do so. And I would encourage you, following this phone call, to feel comfortable to call us, call our office. I have a new legislative director named Janelle Lynch, who has been with the House, went over to the Senate, and we brought her back from the dark side, back to serving here in the House. I'm sure Matt remembers her, but a very bright woman, very helpful. And Bob Nye, who many of you have met, serves as my chief of staff when I was policy chairman, whip, and now here in the leader's office. And they are very open to wanting to meet and learn more what's going on across the Commonwealth. So thank you to Matt and Jen and the rest of your committee, who has graciously invited us many times and shared different ideas with you. Very quickly, as you know, we are in the latter part of the summer portion of the legislative cycle. We are scheduled to come back September 15th, but there's a good potential that I may try to get the speaker to bring us back a week in August, predominantly as we focus on trying to do some revisions to the election process. There was an aggressive utilization of mail-in ballots in the primary, which for some counties were overwhelmed. I think Allegheny County was actually a pretty good model of how that should be handled, and they were very proactive and got themselves some high-speed counters and were much more organized than some of the others. And we are trying to encourage some of the other counties to not be waiting, to be processing those budgets once they're given the time to do so. There's just other discussions that had gone on, and we are trying to have a discussion multiple times with the Senate and the administration and other interested entities to try to put together some changes and revisions to that law, hopefully make this process a little bit better for the fall, because we expect with COVID still hanging over everybody that there will be those that will still choose to vote by mail. And there are others who like the freedom of going and the feeling of being able to walk into the polls and vote, which resources will be set up to do that. But all in all, that is probably the number one thing that's going to draw us back earlier. There is concern in different parts of the Commonwealth over some of the PIAA changes that may occur. There is concern that the fall sports may not occur as the schools continue to grapple with whether to open fully by in-class instruction or some type of hybrid, or whether some of the schools that choose to go completely remote. And that's a debate we could spend hours on, and I'm not here to debate which is better than the others. And fortunately, my children are grown. I do have a grandson who will be starting school in 2 weeks from now. He goes to a parochial school. But in addition to that, there are a lot of families that are very concerned when the PIAA was going to be supportive of this, and then the governor gave a highly strong recommendation that fall sports be canceled until January. As you can imagine, that got a lot of families and sports teams and things very upset. And we are looking at that. There are two pending pieces of legislation to possibly address that, although PIAA did delay a vote that they were going to take on whether to comply with that suggestion for 2 weeks. We anticipate they will either decide to vote on the 24th, or maybe they will postpone that. I believe our education committee chairman told me last night they're going to review these bills, one of which would basically make it eligible that the schools could kind of decide a little bit more on their own whether they're going to have these sports and try to encourage PIAA to support that. And another bill was actually kind of an interesting one that would allow kids to almost get like a red shirt year and try to come back for another year. I'm not sure how well that's going to go over. And frankly, in my experience in high school, once I got to that age, I was pretty much ready to head out of Dodge and started my new chapter of life. But they're interesting proposals, and that's what our committee system's for. We have a very strong committee system and where we like these things to be debated and aired publicly and allow our members of both parties to have input on that. So that's probably what's going to be pushing those types of things. Last but not least, but I have been trying to then steer our members to start thinking about economic recovery. And in line with that, obviously, we have the responsibility to finish the truncated budget that we did earlier this year. We passed a 5-month budget, which spent a little bit over $27 billion of our usual amount, and fully funded our public schools and fully funded our institutions of higher education, predominantly those 4, what we call state-related, Pitt, Temple, and Lincoln, and our state system of higher education, known as the Apache system. As you know, they are also going through some significant revisions. They are debating putting up their prime office area down here in Harrisburg up for sale. We have had several pieces of legislation passed in reference to them as they can continue to try to restructure their own as their enrollment continues to drop. The PASHE system, as many of you know, was designed to try to put some type of educational opportunity in a relatively cost-efficient manner available throughout different parts across the state. And as different opportunities of education grew over the last 50 years or better, there's heavy competition and a lot of students are choosing to go different routes. And we'll see what the long-term impact that's going to be. And in some of our counties like Clarion, that's a significant employer. Lock Haven, which is west of me, same thing. These schools are an economic driver in those communities as well as providing a lower cost educational opportunity. So these are some pretty significant impacts. The last thing I'll throw out before I wrap up on the budget part is, we continue to try to address issues with COVID. And fortunately, I think we're doing a relatively good job. And I don't say that as a Commonwealth, I mean as individuals and communities that trying to bend that curve, keep things down, dealing with some of the spikes. There is a little bit of consternation between the legislature and the governor's office regarding some of the more blanket type policies that have been instituted. And especially for some of our members that live in rural areas who may have only had 3 or 4 COVID cases since its inception, it's very hard for them to encourage their small businesses to comply with a mandate of only having 25% restaurant seating capacity, and obviously the trickle-down effect of the dry cleaners and the hotel businesses. Many of our communities only have 1 or 2 hotels in these small areas, and the impact of these types of blanket orders have been very difficult. We continue to try to work with administration to try to get some flexibility, and I respect the governor's in a difficult position because nobody wants to be the governor who loses a significant amount of the population due to a pandemic, and nor do they want to be the governor who tanks an economy. So this continues to be a little bit of a wrestling match for us. Last but not least, I did want to just focus a little bit back on the budget. I think it's important to take your questions rather than just have me rambling on, but our budget's going to be a struggle. There's no secret to that. We, for the first time in many years, are probably looking at a $4 or $5 billion deficit. It was a lot easier years ago when we talk about maybe millions of dollars of deficits. We could generally find ways to make up for that. We are trying to get a better grip on where that is. As you know, people's income tax returns, both in state and federal level, were delayed. So the actual amount of revenue that we were anticipating versus what we received was delayed until the end of July. So we're trying to get a better figure on what kind of revenues are naturally flowing through us in August, maybe even into September, to get a better barometer of what choices we're going to have to try to fill that deficit. Obviously, one of them is continue to pray that manna comes from heaven. And I do believe there are some who feel that we're going to get additional dollars from Washington. I'm a little bit more conservative on that thought, that I have asked our appropriations chairman to come up with plan B, should that not happen, or the amount not be where they had hoped it would be. And I think it's prudent that we do that. The option 2, obviously, is maybe we are not going to be able to fully fund different entities that we have in the past at the levels we did prior. Our gift of trying to fully fund education has put us in a position that there's not a lot of additional dollars. Matt, serving in the House, knows that our state budget, the bulk of money goes to human services, about 40%, another 40% with all the different educational things that we fund, about 9% to corrections, and a little bit around 7% to our debt servicing. If you do the quick math, that's well under 8% left for us to fully fund or try to adapt money. So the other options is obviously some prudent budgeting within Commonwealth. And I've actually also asked our chairman to have some mini hearings with some of our state agencies, many of which have been working remote for 4, 5, 6 months almost at this point. And I believe it's an opportunity for us to reevaluate what can continue to be done remote, especially the IT services, maybe some of the billing departments, and maybe there is some overhead costs that we can shave off internally before we have to look at other entities outside of state government that we may have to not fund fully as we did last year. And obviously the big ugly question is whether we're going to be raising taxes on different areas. There's very little desire to do that. Some would like to, but frankly, There aren't a lot of businesses left for us to be taxing. A lot of them are starving right now. And with 3.3, 3.4, whatever number you ascribe to, Pennsylvania's on unemployment. I think our goal should be focused on trying to get people back to work and get that cash flow in that way rather than putting an additional tax burden on them. There's many other issues I could go on, but Matt, if it's all right with you, I just as soon open for questions. I don't know what time frame you have. I'm willing to stay and answer questions as long as you need me to do so.
Well, thank you, Representative Benninghoff. We want to thank you not only for your comments and insights and being with us today, but also for your long leadership and partnership on a variety of areas. I know before the pandemic, we were working closely with you and making some headway on some policy issues. So it's nice to see you again.
We haven't given up on those policy issues.
Great, good to hear.
I have a task force internally working on that, so we'll continue.
Great, very good. Good morning, everyone. Welcome to our August 1st Friday. I'm Jen Beer, Vice President of Government Affairs for the Greater Pittsburgh Chamber, and we'll dive into some Q&A now. First, just another reminder that you are able to submit a question via the Q&A function at the bottom of your Zoom. And as usual, we have had a lot of questions come in, so our apologies in advance if we don't get to them all, but I will do my best to get a range of issues out there for the majority leader to comment on. So let's kick this off. I'm actually going to take the liberty, Representative, to touch first on an area that is one of the Chamber's top issues right now, and that is liability reform or liability legislation. So the question is, class action lawsuits are on the rise, and we know there are liability legislation discussions at the federal level, but we would strongly encourage the state to address this issue as well, as it affects healthcare providers, large and small businesses, educational institutions, childcare centers, local governments, nonprofits, all entities alike. So do you anticipate taking up any type of liability legislation this fall?
Sorry for the delay in the answers. I'm trying to be respectful and click off and on, but I will do my best
You
to do
can
that rapidly.
stay on now, that's fine, yeah.
Okay. Yes, there is some dialogue going on about that. We've had multiple people make inquiries, and I think it's important, agencies the size of yours and with multiple facets of different types of businesses involved, that you do weigh in on that. And to me, I think it's a very important issue. My gut tells me to get something accomplished in the short run, it may have to be something that we do specific under the disaster declaration or during COVID. There are some of us who would like to have limited liability reform permanently, but that might be part of a bigger debate later on. And I think we have to try to keep it focused. As you know, there are not that many session days. Doesn't mean we can't add some session days, but that also opens the door for other mischief. But this is an important issue, and I think it is important that agencies like yourselves and your members weigh in with your individual members. This is probably something where your face-to-face dialogues in the local area are just paramount, absolutely paramount to drive the direction of this debate, because I'll close on the fact that there will be all their powers to be that are going to work very hard to make sure this doesn't happen. And so if the compromise is that we pass legislation that helps to facilitate this strictly due to COVID impact and the duration of that disaster declaration, that's a good start. And we can go after the bigger bite of the apple later.
Okay, we'll continue to weigh in there too. Next question, before the legislature left for the summer, you considered a few police reform measures. Can you talk about any thoughts or goals that you or your caucus might have in this area?
Actually, there are multiple bills pending in the Judiciary Committee, and through that earlier discussion where we did move 3 bills out of the House and 2 out of the Senate, it was found that a lot of the members who introduced some of those bills were relatively young in their careers and did not realize, as Matt would probably tell you, that there is a a lot of work on behalf of the author to make sure that they meet with the chairman and dialogue the importance and try to move their own bill. Some of our committees, especially a large committee like Judiciary, gets a tremendous amount of bills. In order to rise your issue to the top, you have to be an advocate on your own bill. And once it goes to the Senate, you got to do the same thing. So that was somewhat of a learning process for many of those who authored those bills. I actually just had a very lengthy conversation yesterday on a justice reform bill having to do with probations, which has taken a lot of bipartisan interest within the legislature. And I kind of look at this as a pathway to better lifestyles for people. And I'm very interested in this proposal. Representative Delosier has been working very closely with Representative Harris out of Philadelphia on this initiative. The Senate also has a version. And ironically, one of the groups I met with yesterday considers himself a very conservative group. Some people may think that they're not necessarily interested in these things, but they're actually very interested. And they come from multiple walks of life. In my quick memory, there's probably 6 or 7 people there from different disciplines. And it was very encouraging to hear them. And one thing I said at the closure of that dialogue, it was nice to hear that these people were pushing this initiative, not strictly from a fiscal perspective. This is about trying to help people not get tripped up in the system who have some infraction that continuously keeps them in this probation system, or sometimes puts them back into jail because they got late to a meeting that they were supposed to be having, or meeting with their probation officers. A lot of different types of things. And I shared a scenario with a gentleman I met in my area in the wintertime. He knocked on my door asking to shovel my walk, for Pete's sakes, at 47 years old, just to make a couple dollars. And I have befriended him and have got him some other work. But interestingly, this guy had an ankle bracelet on, and every time he'd go to Williamsport to meet with the probation guy, he'd have to pay some money towards his fines and his restoration. And finally, I said to him, what is it going to take to get that bracelet off? Because he had to live in a separate place from where he wanted to be because of this bracelet, and he needed $400. We arranged to get that taken care of. He gets there the next visit only to be told he can't get the bracelet taken off because he still owes rental fees on the bracelet. And I think these types of cumbersome, duplicative roadblocks are ridiculous. And I would say to you that that's probably one of the initiatives that's moving forward. I know there are additional police reforms specifically, and we are looking at some of the cost savings in this other initiative in the probations as possibly being a revenue source to help fund some of the police reform training programs, PTSD, and those types of programs. So I think that's significant improvement from where we were 4 or 5 months ago, and I give you my commitment that we'll continue to look at those things and work through them.
Thank you. Yeah, I know you touched a little on the criminal justice reforms as well as the police reforms, and that's something that the chamber has proactively weighed in on. So we thank you and your colleagues. I know you mentioned Representative Delosier, who've been leading on some of those issues. So we'll continue to support there too.
And we're cognizant we've all made mistakes in life, some bigger than others, but to chronically and repetitively punish somebody for the same thing, I think is ridiculous, and we need to streamline that system better.
Agreed. So here's a question about some of the CARES Act funding. What are your plans to allocate the remaining $1.3 billion in CARES Act funding, the federal funding that the state has available?
Well, I wish I had a magic wand and it could duplicate it about 10 times, because we probably have $20 billion worth of requests for that one. It's actually down to $1.1 billion. When I first got elected leader, one of the things I did do is ask the leader in the Senate, because I knew they had kind of a laundry list of requests and taking a little bit more action about moving the rest of that money out. They asked if they would consider that we hold off a little bit of this until fall. My one concern was what we saw in the onset of COVID, that many areas were not fully equipped. Even as late as May, I was running around trying to find PPE equipment for our dental members in our community and some other type of really succinct medical care versus just the hospitals. And my concern was that we may have an upsurgence or some kind of related emergency, and looking at a $4 to $5 billion deficit in the state budget, that we'd have no revenue to address something on a quick level. And Senator Corman was willing to acquiesce to that. At the end of the day, we will eventually be pushing that money out. Where exactly it's going to go, I don't know. There are a lot of requests. As you know, we have shoved a lot of the money out to the counties, and so I've tried to encourage some of our local businesses to speak to their counties and see where they're going to drive some of that out. I know my own county center has been talking about trying to do some type of grant program for local restaurants who have been hit pretty darn hard, and for some of their employees. Sadly, regardless of what we try to do with the last 1.1 billion, it's never going to be enough. Hospital Administration of Pennsylvania Association, they're telling us they have a need of about $10 billion. And we've been in different ongoing dialogues with them, one to try to get them to show us a little bit of paperwork on where that need has come, considering there's a lot of direct subsidies sent out to those agencies. But the discussions on that are not final, and we are trying to be prudent, and I do believe there is some significance in trying to have some available should there be some sudden uptick, and we'll see what the progress is. Unfortunately, as you know, we're treating COVID a little bit different than we did in the beginning of this. We know more about it, which is a good thing, but we will take suggestions. Unfortunately, as I said, we have about $20 billion worth of asks for about $1.1 billion. So we'll do our best.
Okay, thank you. Here is a question a little bit around the budget. I know you got into this a little bit, but the question is if you see any opportunities to achieve material savings in the budget by means of improved efficiencies within existing government programs. And if so, can you speak to any of those being contemplated?
Well, as I said earlier, maybe the questioner didn't hear that, but I apologize. I have asked the appropriations chairman, because I think that's where it's got to start, to consider having some additional hearings, at least with state agencies, whether it's labor and industry, whether it's DEP, whether it's PennDOT or whatever else, to sit down and meet with us, because many of these operations are still operating very remote. Very few of them are back in the buildings. A lot of our legislative districts have struggled to try to get information, get responses as we would normally have because of this. And so I'm not convinced that the efficiency is always there. And more importantly, I do believe a lot of these agencies are able to take care of their IT needs and maybe even their billing remotely, that maybe bringing all these people back into buildings isn't necessarily what we need to do. I told you the state system of Apache is looking at maybe selling some of their properties. I think state government, number one, has to try to find their own ways of reducing their own cost. We have had and continue to have a freeze on hiring within the legislature itself, House Republicans and Democrats, pay increase freeze and those types of things, including our own salaries. And we may have to be looking at reductions as well. My goal as the leader of the House, at least on the Republican side, is to make sure that we lead by example first and try to cut our own costs. But it should be an expectation all across state government. Sadly, it is having an impact on our infrastructure as we are seeing PennDOT not being able to do some of the projects they would like to do. The revenue is not coming in because a lot of people are staying home, and we don't have our predominant funding source, and that is liquid fuels money. So that area is being hit pretty hard. And in one way, we're trying to reduce costs, and unfortunately, some of them are already being reduced because of less utilization, better efficiency in vehicles, the vehicles that are now being used with electric. And so we're having to revisit a lot of those things. You know, last year we had a bill in to address electric cars because they don't pay a fuel tax, and tried to increase their registration fee a little bit to try to help counterbalance that, because the impact on the road and use is still the same. And unfortunately that got stalled after another amendment increased a little bit. So we are trying to be innovative, and I would be the first to tell you we are open to any and all suggestions, but we will do our best to try to lead by example first within state government. And as I said earlier, it may very well be that we will not be spending as much money in this year's state budget, because we can't be spending money that we don't have. We surely can't go to people who are unemployed or businesses who've lost 75% of their income due to some of these mandates.
Thank you. Is the legislature considering any measures to address telehealth?
We've had several opportunities to do that. I happen to be a big advocate of it. I believe there are abilities to do this. I think COVID has shown that we can do a lot of this. Some of you are probably realize there has been a bill working its way through the legislature. Unfortunately, one of our chairmen put an amendment on that made it not popular, and it had to do with an abortion amendment, and the governor had promised to veto it. Whether or not we can convince her to remove that, I believe this is an issue that, again, what we've been going through the last 4 or 5 months has been self-diagnostic as a good tool that we should allow the healthcare industry to use, and some are using it to a pretty good extent, but I'd like to see the telemed bill get completed. And actually, thanks for the question, because it's a reminder in my own agenda to touch base with that individual to see if we can't get them to move off that amendment and get it moving. In fact, I'm going to write that down.
Sounds good. So the next issue here is around connectivity. And so clearly we've seen that this is important for schools and education, businesses, and really now pretty much all of our everyday life. So issues such as 5G infrastructure, rural broadband are now more important than ever. Do you see these issues maybe rising to the top of the agenda this fall, or is there anything that the business community can do to help try to advance these issues?
Well, we did have a couple bills run last time. I believe one actually got passed through. And one of the things that we've been trying to do is to try to encourage collaborative efforts with counties and other providers. And some of it has to do with sharing pole space. While I'm not an expert on these types of things, it seems odd to me that we would have to have every individual entity who provides some type of telecommunications having their own separate poles. I think we've done a good job. If you look at the 911 system across Pennsylvania, that's pretty consistent in its conductivity as it wasn't before. I used to be a county coroner by disclosure, and I live in a very rural area, and there was times where I'd have to, get back in the car and drive to some local mart to try to find a payphone. Well, as you know, there aren't any payphones anymore, and so electronic communication is getting even more paramount. This is going to be a short-term problem for us as schools try to come back, especially those who elect to be all remote. And some of our schools struggle with that in the spring, where they actually had to put packets together and parents would drive by and pick these things up at the school because they didn't have this. We are trying to see what they can do. Sadly, at the end of the day, a lot of this boils down to money. We talk about the last mile in a lot of these more rural areas. It's just cost inefficient to run that last leg out. In my area and some others, we've seen some rural co-ops. If some of you are familiar with electric co-ops, and where these private entities actually start their own little cooperative. In that case, it was electric, but we are now having some in Huntington and others that are putting their own co-ops together to expand broadband, which I think is interesting and innovative in areas where some of the bigger players are not willing to spend the money to put that out. I think demand could push some of our bigger actors like Verizon and Comcast to maybe do some other expansion. And I'll close it with an example of that. I live, again, in a town that's not real big, 6,500 people. And for years, I've watched a natural gas line that has been circling around my house, 1 street and 2 blocks off, and it was never able to get on it. And eventually, as the commodity price dropped so low, the providing company put out a communication with the neighborhood that if we could get 8 people to sign on to this, they would finish the line. And I use that as an example because eventually that is exactly what happened. If you put a appliance on there within 180 days, the $4,400 cost of bringing that line and even doing a lateral in the yard would have been paid for by the company. And everyone complied. They actually picked up 12 residents doing that. So I think that type of interactive, innovative type work between the providers and the utilizers and the customers and people like yourselves, especially when the bigger businesses, when they can bring it into them, sometimes the lateral use then becomes facilitated for some of our private sector.
Right. Got it. Thank you. So the next question, many of our CEO leaders are expressing concerns that while some folks are receiving more income than they have in the past, they're not paying their rent or mortgages or utilities because of the moratoriums. And there is some fear on how this will all be phased back without large consequences on either side. So one way to help address, at least on the utility side, would be through legislation that Representative Quinn has proposed, with flexible funds from the CARES Act to provide additional funding for LIHEAP, the Low Income Home Energy Assistance Program, and provide assistance to small businesses who have been impacted by COVID-19. Can you offer any insights into how this legislation may or may not move forward?
Well, considering it's 9:07, I had the same dialogue about 12 hours ago with Representative Quinn to let me know that he was introducing this bill. And I believe Senator Killian in the Senate has done this.
Yes.
And it's actually a comment I forgot earlier, because it is those types of proposals that are also competing for that same 1.1 billion. Some of the discussion will be whether or not does that money go to the customer to then pay the company, or do we send it directly to the companies? I will tell you that will be a very heated debate. We already have that issue now with ambulance reimbursement and other types of healthcare reimbursements, and where sometimes the providers paid directly, other times the consumers paid with the idea that they'll forward the check and send it on to the provider. And as we know, that system has not worked very well, and we have a lot of providers that don't get paid. I do not see this moving very quickly. I think there's going to be a lot of debate on this, and unfortunately, again, it's competing for other dollars. The whole issue of people receiving more money to stay home than to go back to work, to me, is a greater issue. I think we have to talk about that openly and honestly, and it's not popular to do so. We've had some dialogue with our state, our U.S. senators on this issue as they contemplate expanding the unemployment. And while we're here to help people as much as we can, one of the things we're seeing in our area in businesses that have been able to be opened up, I suspect it's no different in your area, they can't get some of their employees back. And so they're at a kind of a quagmire. Do they go and find new employees and then have to retrain them, or is there a way to incentivize them to come back? You know, one of the things I said to Senator Toomey, which might not be popular by some of your listeners, is rather than give an additional $600 to the individual on top of the other unemployment they were getting, maybe we ought to take $200 of that and give it to the employer who motivates people to come back to work, and then give $200 to those individuals who go back to work. It's becoming a very vicious circle, in where we're almost incentivizing those, especially in some of the other unskilled laborers, who are making more money staying home than they were going back to work. It's becoming a work shortage for people. And that's a long answer to your original question, but that's the complexities of what gets in these debates and these discussions. I respect where these utilities are, and we hear the same thing for 4 or 5 other entities who would like to get direct subsidy by the CARES dollars rather than to the consumer, because they know they're probably not going to get paid. And by disclaimer, I am a landlord as well. And we're seeing this with people who don't want to make their car payments, other bank loans, and I worry we're going to get to a point of diminishing returns. At the end of the day, the important thing is get people back to work. I think there's a psychological impact.
Yep. Yeah, thank you. It's good to hear that that's still on the radar.
Yes.
So here's a question that our chamber is actually starting to work on as well. So I'm glad it's being asked. COVID-19 put a spotlight on our over-reliance of goods and products that are manufactured offshore. Do you think there is an appetite or opportunity to engage in a dialogue with the legislature about ways Pennsylvania can be proactive in enticing companies to restore to Pennsylvania?
Absolutely. And I'm #1 cheerleader for that. I have a motto in my office I started when we first started here, and I said, let's make Pennsylvania the envy of the East. And I just think that there's a lot of great, bright individuals in this Commonwealth, a lot of different businesses, researchers and things, and we ought to try to escalate that to the best of our ability. We saw some of this conversion happening throughout the country, some here in Pennsylvania, where companies were converting what they were tooling one day to retooling, whether it's automobiles, into making ventilators, and whether it was other types of manufacturers who subsequently started to make synthetic masks and other PPE equipment. the ingenuity and ability and talent is there, I believe so. And frankly, I think we should be rewarding that and wanting to encourage that here in the Commonwealth as well as our country. I think there's a lot of enthusiasm to do that. Most recently, you may have saw the the local manufacturing petroleum bill that we passed. It was a tax credit type thing, trying to encourage and incentivize companies who may have a spin-off. They are not necessarily producing natural gas or a liquid petroleum, but they're using these types of things, subsidies of these products in smaller communities. And this set up the ability for them to have some startup dollars through a tax credit to try to incentivize companies to do this. There's actually one who's already applied and is trying to be applicable for this up in the northeast part of the state. This is for your analogy, excuse me, similar to your cracker plant, but much, much, much smaller. I think those types of incentives, one, will bring people here to Pennsylvania to do this. And frankly, not just related to the natural gas industry, but as you know, that has been an economic driver, and we need to find a way to continue to utilize that and try to help facilitate some of the spin-off companies. I talked to you a little bit earlier about, I forgot the name of it, was American Precision Metals Company. Now, we toured this facility and have a very bright, innovative individual who feels very strongly about trying to produce as much of these products in state. And he's one of few people that uses a raw material to cut it down into other types of available feedstock. I never really thought about where a fork comes from, but he's cutting these bands down in smaller pieces. Eventually, they're going to be cut in 12-inch pieces, and they're going to be stamped down to forks. As a guy, the portion he showed me was the feedstock that's going to make the X-Acto blades that go into our, I call them drywall knives. But you think of hundreds of millions of these things are produced, and here this gentleman's cutting them, and they're very low waste in what he does and the way they design these things. And they put a cutting edge on, and just seeing some of the young people he had working there, his one lead guy in the shop was not very old. And matter of fact, it was ironic, the guy was from Bellefonte. He couldn't believe I was from Bellefonte. But it was just neat to see somebody who's investing in some of our young people, sees the importance of developing raw material here in our own Commonwealth for other types of investments. And I want to help to keep perpetuating those types of things. And I would not have known it had I not gone to visit that. So kudos to Tim O'Neill, who had me come out and visit that. And we're going to do what we can to help that business continue to grow.
That's great. Okay, I'm going to try to combine two questions here, a little bit on local government assistance, as well as see if you can touch on tax credits. But earlier this week, we saw some mayors and municipal leaders from across the state join together to encourage Congress and the Trump administration to restart negotiations for a COVID relief package that would include direct aid to our municipalities and our localities. So that's something I know at the conference, we're definitely looking into ways that we can additionally support financially our local governments and communities. And I would say that one way that we do that particularly well here in the Southwest is through one of the DCED programs, the Neighborhood Assistance Program, the NAP tax credit. We feel this is a very important way that our businesses can directly invest in our local communities, especially those that are struggling. So maybe a two-part question, or a comment and a question, I guess. We, as I said, we really utilize this program well out in the Southwest, so we'd encourage continuation of this program, but just wanted to see if you could touch on tax credits in general. We'd be hopeful that this one in particular will stay strong, but are you hearing about any talks with tax credits in relation to the finalizing of the budget?
Two things, I'll digress one moment. One of the things I've tried to tell some of my local municipalities is get in line fast for the money that the counties have received. Some counties are, again, deliberating with what to do with the money that got sent directly to them regarding COVID dollars. Number two, you're the first I've heard talk about the Neighborhood Assistance Program for a while. And one of the things I would encourage you, because you have a lot of younger members in the legislature out there, is to make sure somebody, yourselves or whomever, The questionnaire touches base with them. If they feel this is a good program, our members need to hear that. Oftentimes, I'm sure Matt will tell you, we create things because we mean well and have good intentions, and then when they go off in the sunset and we never realize how efficient they are or not efficient, and programs can get cut in the middle of budget cycles because nobody hears anything about them. And when I was out visiting the American Precision Metals, we were talking about different programs that they might be eligible for. And one of the things I had mentioned to Tim and to the owner is, have you looked at business in our sites? There's a program that's a little bit easier for people to get into than some of our different grant programs. And sometimes we get really dependent on these things. I will say there is some consternation with the members on tax credits and getting more tax credit programs. By disclosure, I had the analysis done of Pennsylvania's overall tax system by the Tax Foundation in Washington, and one of the things that they kind of discourage is additional tax credit programs. Now, that doesn't mean that they're all going to be gone, but I think it's important that we help rise the ones that are efficient and effective to the top. And as I said, because we have had such turnover in the legislature, sometimes members are not exposed to these because they just haven't had to utilize them. That I think your group and your members can be great advocates when they say, listen, come see this, or this is why we need this. Again, I have such a better appreciation just for that metal processing. And I grew up with a father who was a metallurgist. He dealt with brass and copper, but our members have different issues of importance to themselves or experiences in their own lives. But we vote on an array of issues that I would encourage you to share your beliefs. Don't feel ashamed, not shame, what's the word I want? Don't feel uncomfortable about also expressing that to people who don't live in your legislative areas. People that are in leadership, our appropriations chairmen, both House, Senate, both R's and D's, they need to say, hey, as a chamber, as a community group, as a township's official, you need to understand, we don't have a lot of revenue. This is a big program for us.
Great. We will continue to get that word out.
Thank you.
Couple more questions here. How about childcare? We know that childcare is a critical factor in getting people back to work. Is there any more that can be done to assist the childcare facilities at this time?
Well, they too are kind of in line for the COVID dollars, and I had some lengthy discussions with some of my locals. And sometimes as policymakers, especially for those of us who are over 29 with 38-year-old children, we kind of forget about those types of things. I do have 6 grandchildren, and I see what the challenges my daughters have in trying to figure out whether they go back to work, whether they don't go back to work. Childcare is obviously very expensive these days. We don't have a lot of programs, obviously, that direct subsidize those. I prefer programs in where businesses provide that service or provide some type of thing there. So whether or not we could find an incentive to incentivize businesses. I had a program several years ago, unfortunately it got cut, but it was called PEP, and it was basically Pennsylvania Employment Promotion, and it was allowing companies to reinvest what income tax dollars they would normally send to us to hire more employees. As long as they could show that they hired more employees, the income tax they would normally give to us, they could keep as long as they're growing their business. And I use it as an example that, maybe there's something we could do along those lines to incentivize businesses to have on-site childcare. Childcare is hard, but when you have it on site, obviously it makes it easier for parents who are having to travel and get their children, got to get out of work right away. That I've found, especially when I worked at a hospital, I never understood why hospitals weren't a great example of trying to do this more, because they have such a large employer base. A lot of them are young women, young mothers, and I think a parent is a lot more content and more productive at work if they aren't sitting around worrying about their child or the child's more close by. So I wish I had a distinct answer for you, but that's probably something that needs to have a greater dialogue, most definitely.
Yeah. Thank you. Here's another somewhat of an add-on to the local government question that we just touched on. But for many years, if not decades, smaller municipalities across the Commonwealth have been struggling to make ends meet and serve their constituents as tax revenue continues to decline. as it relates to Allegheny County in particular, there have been some discussions about the legislator pushing a voluntary municipal disincorporation measure that would enable some struggling municipalities to merge or dissolve if it's in the best interest locally. Do you have any thoughts on how the legislature can help reform our municipal government structure? And I think maybe possibly through a municipal disincorporation bill or legislation.
It's encouraging to just to have that question asked because it's not always a popular topic.
Right.
I've been around here for 24 years, and some of the words that get most ire is words like consolidation. And again, I'm only using my example locally because it's what I've lived, but I see it other places. But I have several municipalities who provide mutual aid to each other, especially in police services for the 3 to 11, 11-7 shift. But if you ever talked about combining them, it was like killing the sacred cow, and it just never made any sense to me. Ironically, where I actually live physically, if you go 2 blocks behind me, you exit the borough I'm in, and for the last 3 blocks, you're into a township. And when I first moved there, the borough truck would actually stop behind my house when it was plowing, go down left to the street and leave, and the other township would have to come over and finish the other several blocks. And similar kind of things with policing. Unfortunately, those kind of cooperative efforts have changed, but we should not look at regionalization, consolidation as a bad thing. Frankly, there just isn't the economics there. For a long time, people don't want to change the color of their cars. They don't want to, in our case, we have several municipalities I think should combine and have one regional police force. It's not easy to do that. But your question about allowing people to voluntarily do that on their own should be a no-brainer for the legislature. I believe the legislature is here to enable local governments, local people to make decisions that are best for them. And frankly, I would be interested in hearing more about that and seeing what actions are being taken by whether it's municipal league or the boroughs association, those types of things. We can't be holding on to turf just for turf purposes. Again, my little town of 6,500, we still have 2 fire stations. And the argument used to be it was because one had a ladder truck and one didn't have a ladder truck. Well, most of our buildings aren't over 5 stories anyhow. But the reality, if we want to be honest with ourselves, is one has a liquor license and one doesn't. So you can draw the lines between the dots and figure out why they won't combine. And I think economics is going to drive that. If anything positive comes out of this COVID thing, I think it is really starting to force people as individuals and as community leaders to start rethinking how we do things. And that's probably going to be a good thing. So however we can help facilitate your desire, should you want to see that enabling legislation happen, please be in contact with our office and we'll get you into contact with the right chairman to see what their interest is. But that's a discussion that should happen.
That's great. That's great to hear. I think we will be reaching out. We think the time is right to restart these discussions.
2,600 municipalities in the state of Pennsylvania. It's silly.
Yeah, just another tool in the toolbox. Is
I had a farmer one time call me because he was being harassed about having junk cars on his property. And I asked him what township it was. I was really early in my career. And he told me, and I said, is your entire property in that? He said, no. And I said, well, then pull the junk trucks over to the other side of the property. And that's what he did. I mean, as silly as it sounds, I wouldn't probably go that direction now. But, the irony is the other municipality had no ordinance against it. He just drugged the stuff over, 14 acres on the other side of his property. But it's a good, silly example of how the fragmented system of 2,600 municipalities really makes things very difficult and inefficient.
Exactly. That is Pennsylvania right now, right? Okay, well, maybe I'll have this be your last question. We'll wrap up a little bit. I know that you're well aware of the transportation and infrastructure funding cliff that the state has to deal with in the coming year and a half or so, and specifically transit caused by the sunsetting of payments from the Turnpike to PennDOT, and that's been on our radar. How do you see this issue playing out? I know it's a little bit maybe more long-term, but is there any opportunity maybe the pandemic or the budget, discussions, and how can we be helpful to raise this issue for the legislature.
Well, again, like every issue in Harrisburg, everything boils down to 102 votes in the House, 26 in the Senate, and a supportive vote by the governor. So part of that discussion, I believe, has to happen locally. I would tell you not to assume that every one of your legislators is sitting around thinking about this. We've talked about an array of issues, and some of them will specialize on some of those different areas. And more importantly, most of your members don't sit on that particular committee. We have 24 members generally in most of our standing committees. My math's off, probably 25. 14 Republicans and 11 minority party, regardless of who's in power. That being is a lot of these members aren't necessarily discussing these issues until a bill were to move forward. I've asked Martina White to give a little bit of a presentation to our chamber, as she had sat on and headed up the task force that Brian Cutler put in place as leader, trying to come up with some solutions towards this issue. We thought we had this cured when we passed Act 89, and several years ago in the court administration, which would have generated about $3.2 billion annually. But as we all know, that's not happening. Some of that's because we're a victim of our own efficiencies. And as we get cars that get better fuel mileage, different types of modes of transportation that are no longer using fuels, it is not the primary funder anymore, or can't be for the long run, because it's not going to work. There are those who advocate miles travel, and that's a discussion that's happened and occurs in some other states, and just another way of trying to generate revenue. Frankly, trying to find a new resource is never that easy. I told you how simply I thought the electric car increase in the registration was a fair way to go. I think it went from $175 to $250, and that increase of $75 just slammed the door on trying to get that proposal through. There are many members who feel that any touch to non-fossil fuel vehicles is an attack on the environment. Some of us see it just as a fairness. Cars still have weight, you're still impacting the road, you still have an impact on utilization, that it's only fair. I look at it as a fairness issue. But without other input and organizations like yourself weighing in and saying this is a priority, we could digress to pre-89 in where we're only going to have revenue to do moderate repairs, overlays, and we'll get back into dwindling bridges. We have 24,000 plus bridges in Pennsylvania. We historically tried to refurbish, replace, or somehow renovate about 300 of those a year. And we were pretty much on track with that pre-COVID. But with the diminishing revenues, we could digress in that pretty fast. And the other thing we're seeing is the ability for expansion. We're not able to do before Act 89 was a lot of expansion of other roads. I know some of you have some other interchanges you might want to fix, or some bypasses. Increased capacity falls off the chart really fast when revenues go down. And we just can't have that if we want to have safety as a priority, and if we want to be moving commerce and people efficiently. So it's got to be a priority. I've been criticized for voting for infrastructure improvement programs, but frankly, I feel it's one of the fundamental responsibilities of state government on a statewide level, obviously, as well as locally. But there is no secret silver bullet to this, because frankly, it all boils down to money and having the courage to make these votes. I'm still getting yelled at by my friends who pay $54,000 for a pickup truck that gets 11 miles a gallon. That somehow it's my fault because they're spending so much money in gas. That's a discussion for another day, but you can do the math there. But the perception is people don't want to pay anymore. I talked with former Secretary Shope the other day. There is an initiative to consider bumping up percentage on wholesale value, and I can't remember exactly the equation, but basically it has to do with if the commodity price drops, it would go up another 2 cents. But 2 cents at the wholesale, generally the average person doesn't feel the impact of it. It's probably a smarter way to do it politically, but it also has got some type of reality to its assessment of when it would adjust. And I apologize, I don't have more of the particulars on it, but I found it to be a very intriguing initiative, and probably is one that's more palatable for us to get through, and would be more driven by the market, and hopefully keep up with times a little bit better. It's surprising how much revenue that could generate. So that is in the making, and former secretary is trying to work on that, and I think he's a good spokesperson for that. It might be something you might want to call him and actually have him do a Zoom on that issue or other suggestions. Very bright individual, was very helpful with Act 89, and could obviously articulate that much better than I am today. So I'll just put the tickler in there for you, but I think it's something your organization should hear about, because I think he could be a motivator.
No, that's great. Thank you. We will reach out to him. He was great. Well, thank you so much, Majority Leader Benninghoff, for your time today and your insights. And perhaps even more importantly, thank you for your leadership during these tough times. We look forward to continuing to partner with you and your office in the future. So
I feel blessed to be able to do that, and also our relationship. And I wanted to thank you for having us part of your organization, and for your listeners. If I bored you to death, I'm sorry. If I didn't answer something, I told Jen and Matt, feel free to contact them, send it to us, and I'll do our best to answer your questions. Might take me a couple days, but we will get you answers. We're all in this together. Let's work together. And I want to see your region grow. I want to see Center County grow. I want to see Philadelphia grow. And we can do all this stuff if we all work together on it. In my opinion, this is the greatest state in the union, and I want to make us the envy of the East.
that's great. Thank you.
Have a great day, everybody.
Thank you, Representative. Thank you to all of our participants in today's webinar. Special thank you to the First Friday Response and Recovery Speaker Series webinar sponsors, all of which are listed on the slide. We hope you continue to find these conversations helpful and informative. Also, a very special thank you to Peoples, Giant Eagle, Highmark, UPMC Health Plan, and our 300 other regional investors for their generous support, which allows us to bring you this conversation today. And for those of you who may not be aware, the conference has launched a website that we hope serves as a resource for all of you, and there is a repository of important resources, legislative updates, and ways you can help and to get help. And that website is AlleghenyConference.org/COVID-19. And the conference has also launched a ReadyPittsburgh.com website as a curated toolbox of resources to help businesses and organizations safely return to work. So again, thank you to everybody, Giant Eagle, Peoples, Highmark, and UPMC Health Plan. Thank you for your attendance today, and hope you all have a great weekend.